Hello, friends. Well, today we're going to talk about Emperor Qin Shi Huang and the discovery of the Terra Cotta Army and sort of get into some details as to why the Terra Cotta Army was created and the beliefs of the afterlife that Qin Shi Huang had. So the story picks up in spring of 1974 in West Yang Village. It was the middle of a drought, and 6 brothers were digging a well. After digging 1 meter down into the well, the brothers hit something very strange, something metallic, essentially like hard iron, and sparks were flying whenever their picks struck it. For the next 2 days, they dug up loads of earth and bits of pottery. They didn't really think much of it, but they just kept digging, still trying to find water. But as the dirt shifted around, after still being removed, sticking out of the earth was a head, 2 eyes, staring right up at them. The brothers found other things as well, such as arrowheads that were made of bronze. Many of the bronze arrowheads were sold to a local recycling center, not really knowing what their significance was. The Yang brothers didn't actually realize what they'd stumbled upon, but a local museum worker from a nearby town, Zhao Kangmen, caught wind of the discovery. He started connecting the dots because many years earlier, different farmers had dug up similar figures, but the finds were very spotty and no connection to the first emperor had been established. Zhao knew, though, that this had to be connected because the bricks that were found around the figures were the same as the ones that were found near the first emperor's tomb. So Zhao was able to stop the well digging. In doing so, he was able to start the process that would eventually be one of the most profound historical discoveries ever. So now I'm going to take some time to give you the historical background of the terracotta figures and the emperor who commissioned them and what his beliefs were that led him to do so. Historian John Mann will explain. Why did those clay figures so fascinate China and the world? One reason is because they are ghosts from history's subconscious, capturing in outward and visible form the crucial 2 decades, the years from 230 to 210 BC, when the first emperor forced 7 states to become one and then imposed on his new nation a series of giant projects. It's not simply that the upright military figures seem to symbolize their times, it's that their faces seem to reflect the character of the man himself, stern, expressionless, implacable. So here's a picture of the first emperor, and historian John Mann is going to go into that a little bit about the accuracy of these pictures. Power made the first emperor a terrifying figure. He seems to have been physically unattractive, high-pointed nose, slit eyes, pigeon breast, stingy, cringing, graceless. Traditional portraits of him don't conform to this lean and hungry image, showing him as bearded, bulky, and always wearing headgear like a mortarboard with tassels dangling down the front to hide his semi-divine features from mortal gaze. It's all totally inauthentic, of course, since there were no contemporary portraits. But as with Christ, Genghis Khan, and alien abductors, there arose an accepted, iconic version of what he was supposed to look like. Certainly he was moody, easily angered, unpredictable, traits that he shared with other dictators. Hitler and Stalin come to mind. Almost from his own day, the first emperor was seen as a brutal tyrant, inhumanely impressing hundreds of thousands of people into forced labor to fulfill his grandiose ambitions. It has been part of accepted history that he burned books, destroyed the records of his predecessors, and buried scholars alive because they opposed him. His ruthlessness has been a fact of life for the past 2 millennia. So what we know about the emperor comes from Sima Qian's book, Records of the Grand Historian, who wrote his account 100 years after the Qin Dynasty, essentially writing the account 1st century BC during the successor to the Qin Dynasty, which was the Han Dynasty. Some revisionism has been required over the years, as someone living in the following dynasty that defeated the Qin would be less accurate and be somewhat biased. And this is where archaeology has to fill in many of the gaps. So the shining achievement of Qin Shi Huang was unifying China. And although he was the first to actually achieve it, he was not the first to attempt it. The Shang Dynasty had attempted it 1,000 years earlier, but the Zhou Dynasty eventually took them over. So during the Zhou Dynasty period, Confucianism was the primary religion that was practiced, which of course Confucianism, based on the teachings of Confucius, who taught about morality and how to relate to others in your world and personal ethics as well. He had a big part in that. But all that was the spiritual beliefs of the Zhou Dynasty period. But spiritual beliefs of the Chinese did evolve over time. Divination became very popular. Rulers began to latch onto the idea of heaven, essentially a divine right of kings. So the Zhou period was one where city-states became very common, and city-states went to war against each other. At one point, there were thousands of Zhou city-states, but as these warred with each other, by 3rd century BC, they were whittled down essentially into 7 separate city-states that ruled China. A century earlier, Sun Tzu had wrote his book, very popular book called The Art of War. This writing was a result of the very turbulent period of war that it was written in, with all these warring city-states. Many generals, even in modern times, look to this practical work. It's been studied in military academies for centuries. Even Norman Schwarzkopf, who was the architect of the Gulf War, definitely referred to Sun Tzu's The Art of War in figuring out his strategies. Out of the 7 city-states, there was one that had a geographical advantage, and that was, of course, the Qin Dynasty. It had the Yellow River and the mountains that were protecting it. Pretty much all 7 city-states had the same weapons technology: bows, arrows, armor, and even the crossbow, which was the most effective weapon of the day. But the question arises, how did Qin Shi Huang conquer all of the other city-states in essentially what was a time period of just a few years? Historian John Mann is going to give the answer to that. The answer lay in organization on every level. Qin society was a state-sized fighting machine. At its heart, under the Iron Hand, were 3 independent elements: efficient agriculture, based on rich farmland of the Wei Valley, which provided food and excess manpower; a committed bureaucracy which gathered taxes, made lists of recruits, oversaw irrigation, and managed the food supply to the army, and the army itself, a large professional force. The emperor had a desire for national unity, largely in search of security in an uncertain world. As a result, the Qin Dynasty conquered the core of what is recognized as modern China. So when the name Qin became translated worldwide, it became China. So once he conquered China, Qin Shi Huang had to focus on centralizing his power. The first step was embracing his name. Actually, he was formerly known as King Xing when he was simply the ruler of the Qin territory, but Qin Shi Huang name implied that he was imperial ruler, god, and sage all in one. For simplicity's sake, I'm just going to refer to him as the first emperor. After establishing his title, the next thing he had to do was to get a claim of sort of a divine right, essentially using religion to consolidate power. And he was going to do this by sweeping away all of the Confucianism religion that was present during the Zhou Dynasty. And he attempted to do this using Taoist mystics. These were self-proclaimed sages that believed in ensuring control of one's destiny, not just in this life, but ensuring immortality in the next. The next thing he had to do were political reforms. The feudal hierarchies that existed previously during the Zhou dynasty were gone. Instead, the emperor placed 36 controlled segments that were called commanderies, which were essentially the equivalent of counties. Each commandery had a civil administrator and a military administrator that reported directly to the emperor. All ruling families would move to Xianyang, the Qin capital. Also, there was a bit of sort of a weapons type control going on as well, because from the other 6 defeated states, weapons were collected and melted down. But that wasn't the most lasting reform that the emperor made. The most lasting reform that he made was the standardization of Chinese writing. Doing so ensured that whenever the emperor issued an edict, it could be read regardless of the language of that area. In fact, as many dialects that are around in China even today, the visualization of the written language is still standard regardless of dialect. So the other reform was the labor force. A large segment of the labor force was fighting wars with all the warring city-states. Now they were able to focus more on projects which included creating paved roads. And the one project that was the crown jewel was the Great Wall. One of the emperor's generals, Ming Qian, headed north chasing out barbarians and then began construction of the Great Wall. Other building projects included a palace at Apang to replace the one at Xiangyang. Another project was a tomb. Historian John Mann explains the beliefs of the emperor and why the tomb was made the way that it was. The dominant ideas in the remote past were that we have souls that live forever, and that we should make provision for them. But by the time of the first emperor, these ideas had evolved. Now it was believed that we have 2 souls, the spirit soul, which inspired thoughts, virtues, and artistic abilities, and which flew off to the land of the immortals at the moment of death, and the earth soul, which was at that point left behind, in some way attached to the corpse to be buried with it. Both souls needed care and attention so that one could travel freely and the other could find peace rather than roam the earth lost, restless, and hungry. All this was necessary because it was the first realistic way of fulfilling the dead person's needs. It was realism that was the key. Though not quite in the Western sense, flesh and blood was not enough because it decayed, nor was function important. Real objects as used in this world were included, but often the objects would be made deliberately non-functional. What was critical was a certain sense of detail, so real people and animals were replaced by small figures in wood, clay, bronze, stone, and jade. They were, in a sense, toys. The toy artifacts provided the elements from which spirits were expected to recreate the living world. So the thing that is very interesting about the objects that were buried, representing attendants, soldiers, animals in the hundreds, the objects are roughly 1/3 life size. Essentially, these were almost doll-like. But the Terra Cotta Army was different. They were full size. So it's thought that those actually had to be an undertaking in order to make. I will say that it's very likely that the Terra Cotta Army was made life-size in lieu of making them doll-like, because they viewed the army as the most important facet of Qin Shi Huang and his empire. So the short yet very busy period of the Qin Dynasty would see an omen that seemed to be a sign of a downfall by the mystics of the day. That would be in 212 BC when a meteorite fell. Someone had hand engraved on that meteorite the following message: the first emperor will die and his land will be divided. The emperor, angered of this, ordered an investigation, and the locals that were around the meteorite were executed, and then the rock was then destroyed. 2 years later, the emperor was on a tour of his empire, trying to keep things positive. And during this time, the emperor was also on a side quest trying to gain immortality. And someone had given him a potion that was supposed to do this. Very likely this potion may have purposely been poisoned, and it was thought to contain mercury. At the age of 50, he fell ill, and then it became apparent that he was going to die, and preparations had begun for his death, including working out the succession. The first in line to the throne was the emperor's son, Fusu. Fusu, who was holding to the teachings of Confucius, had previously been exiled due to critical statements that he made of his father's heavy-handed rule against the beliefs of Confucius. Nonetheless, it seems that the emperor intended Fusu to still succeed him when he died, but it wouldn't quite be that simple. There wasn't any knowledge of the death of the emperor, and he died on a tour of the empire. If it had become knowledge that he had died while the tour was still supposed to be going on, then the people in these areas could rebel, knowing that the emperor was no longer around, and the bulk of the armies were actually back at the capital and not around to ensure the empire's stability. So the Chancellor Li Si, who was essentially the emperor's second in command, came up with a plan. The thought was, if they could get back to the capital before the death was discovered, the empire could continue to be stable. So the emperor's body would be placed in a covered carriage. Cooks would deliver food as if he were still alive. Papers would be forged with the emperor's seal by Li Si. Fusu, his son, would be kept in the dark about the death, because if he knew, he would certainly take over. In fact, Li Si would likely have to resign or possibly be forced to commit suicide. Because of Fusu's past behavior, they didn't want the succession to happen. So essentially, as much as this sounds like the plot to Weekend at Bernie's, they pretended like he was alive as the entourage proceeded towards the capital. It was said that a cart with dead fish was driven in front of the emperor's carriage to cover up the smell of the emperor's decomposing body. Finally, September of 210 BC, the entourage arrived at Zhanyang, the capital. At that point, they were ready to announce the death. To deal with Fusu succeeding to the throne, a letter was forged essentially commanding Fusu by his father to commit suicide for his past disloyalty. The plan worked, and then the younger son, Hu Hai, would ascend to the throne. But some sources raise questions about this and believe that Hu Hai had his brother killed instead, and that he did not commit suicide, as was reported. As for the burial of the emperor, historian Sim Qian indicates that in the underground palace, many concubines were buried alive with the emperor so that he could procreate in the next life. The second emperor, Hu Hai, who had renamed himself Qin Shi, lacked the fortitude of his father. Zhao Gao, who was his top advisor, controlled Hu Hai as a puppet. Zhao Gao, fearing that forces within the empire were dooming it to its end, unleashed a reign of terror, which the second emperor happily signed off on. As the family, including surviving brothers, were his biggest threat, 6 princes were put to death and several more were forced to commit suicide. By 209 BC, the cracks in Hu Hai's rule had already shown. Many nationwide rebellions had begun. Zhao Gao was in charge of squashing these rebellions, and while the rebellions weren't completely successful, they severely weakened the rule of Qin Shi. Zhao Gao then conspired with soldiers to take control of Qin or Shi, forcing the 22-year-old emperor to commit suicide. Qin or Shi was buried in a relatively modest tomb with no army or temple. Ziying, who is said to have been a son of Fusu, was made to be the king of the Qin state, as by now the dynasty as it was no longer existed. Ziying eventually had Zhao Gao killed, brushing away the remnants of the Qin dynasty as it was. Ziying, though, only ruled about 47 days as rebel forces took over the capital. Eventually, within a few years, in 206 BC, the Han Dynasty would emerge and continue with their own unified version of China. Work on the Great Wall would continue for another 1,000 years or so, finally being completed by the Ming Dynasty, so that legacy was only partially held by the Qin, although they deserve credit for being the first to unify China as it even remains today. I appreciate your attention going through this history of the very interesting Qin Dynasty. See you next time. Good night.